So hello everybody and welcome to a new video. Today we're looking at the magic triangle, not the Bermuda Triangle. The magic triangle between the instrument, the string and the bow. So how do we get this three-body problem sorted? Which can be quite a challenge for really pretty much everyone. And so I've invested quite a bit of time and energy, and with the help of our friends from the string manufacturers, particularly Larsen and Tomastic, we have been able to get a pretty clean side into the whole topic. I mean, we've been developing our bows in ways to make it possible to find the perfect bow for every instrument, which I'll get to in a moment. But first of all, let's take a look at strings. And to find the right strings, of course, we have first of all to understand the instrument properly. And it's about two things. One, that's the obvious one, that is brilliance or warmth. So it is the instrument, is the tone of the instrument. When you put, let's say, a medium string on, is it brilliant or is it dark? Or is it also balanced? So you can counter a sound that appears too warm for you with a brilliant sounding string, or if the instrument's already quite brilliant, you can go for or opt for a warmer, darker sounding string. So that much is pretty easy. What's more important though is to get the strings with the right tension on your violin. And that's a little more difficult. Part of that because the information we get from the string makers is, I find, not 100% what we need to find the right strings. And after much experimentation, I found that it is very useful to focus on the lower three strings, so the G, D and A string, and leave the E string out in the beginning. So I've made a little chart here, which you can find the download for in the description. So I've sorted this chart by adding up the lower three strings, leaving out the E string, which you might anyways look for options, and they don't last very long anyway. So the E strings, it can be a very good idea to exchange an E string 2 or 3 times with a given set of strings. Maybe sometimes you also want to replace the A string, but the D and G usually last a lot longer than the A, and particularly the E string. So we can play around with that anyways. So now, how do we know whether we need a low tension, a high tension or a medium tension string? That is actually more easy than many people think. So fundamentally, when you have a very flexible instrument, you need soft strings or flexible strings. And by the way, also a flexible bow. So we want harmony in the elasticity department, while in the sound department we want to balance things out. So, but again, for the elasticity, we will all want to go flexible string, flexible for a flexible instrument and a more flexible bow, and a stiffer violin needs stiffer strings and a stiffer bow. Okay, now I have 2 examples here, and we can quite easily determine whether it's a flexible instrument by a couple of factors. We can look at the arching. The arching is relatively flat of this instrument. It's also comparatively a little bit on the lighter side maybe, and the bass ball's not too high, but you know, it can be a challenge to really judge those components, but you can make a pretty simple test, and that's by finding out what the main body resonance is. We also know it as the wolf tone, and you can find it with the glissando on the D string. It's usually around B, H, the lower one, and the higher one is around C, C sharp, D. So let's see where we have it here. They usually spread out a little over 1.5 tones. So here we find it around B and C sharp, which is good, but definitely a little bit on the lower side. This violin has fitted some Pirastro Violino strings, and they have a fairly low tension at 13.9 kilograms, the lower 3 strings combined. And with these low tension strings, this instrument has opened up tremendously. It came to me with much higher tension strings on and really didn't sound particularly well. It was like compressed and didn't play well, and it really opened up with these strings. And also the main body resonance came higher a little bit by relaxing the string tension. And I've combined it with an M series bow, which works just amazing. So the violino is not a string I would put on most instruments, but on this violin, it's wonderful. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, we have an instrument like this. This is a very heavy built instrument, also German, like the first one, so the origin doesn't say anything about this. The arching is actually not really higher, but it's much more strongly built, and the wood is also much stiffer. So the flaming is not very deep of the back. It's really significantly thicker built, and also the bass bar is quite a bit higher. But in this case, it's particularly the ribs that are quite strong. So the ribs on that instrument are just a little over 1 millimeter, which is perfectly fine and normal. These, I believe, were around 1.6, 1.7, something like that. And it stiffens up the instrument considerably. And there's not really so much you can do about it. But let's check the main body resonance again. Oh, we can do that by tapping just as well as we can do glissando. Or we do both tests, best of all. So you tap it where the seat post meets the back. That's where you hear the higher main body resonance. And the lower one you can find pretty much anywhere else. Or, like I said, by finding the wolf tones. So the wolf tone is not too bad, but you hear when you do this glissando, you hear when the sound of the tone all of a sudden increases and gets very energetic and yeah, a little too much maybe. And here we have them at C, and D sharp around. So that's a bit on the stiff side, and this instrument does feel stiff. And so what you put on such an instrument is a heavy gauge string. In this case, I put on the Larsen Zigarren Strong, which has the benefit of not only being a strong string, but is also comparatively warm. And many of these very stiff instruments actually are a bit on the bright side. So that's one of the good solutions for a stiffer build, bright sounding instruments. It is still a little bit on the bright side, but I think it's okay. And I'm using here a P series bow, which is our strongest bow. Now, let's take a look at our line of bows and how they match this idea. So on the right side here, towards stiff and hard, we have the P series. On the softer side, towards flexible, we have the M. Wooden bows, by the way, are all pretty much on the softer end of the spectrum, because they were originally designed for pure gut strings. So no metal wound strings with relatively low tension or very little in terms of reflectivity. Goodness me, is that a word? So to play on a pure gut string, you don't really need a very stiff or strong bow. But with modern strings, things are different. And the medium here, this line is where we figure our most medium tension strings nowadays, and that's also the median for the setup and build of modern instruments, or how nowadays instruments are set up and built, the good ones at least. And here you can see we have three different type of bows, the G, T, and S, and I'll show you those in a minute. But to finish off with this elasticity thing, so if, for example, I take a strong bow like the P and play that on a flexible instrument, this instrument and the strings feel like rubber. The bow's just too strong for that. And going back to that stiff string, everything's in balance and feels real good. Well, when I take the more flexible M series bow and try the heavy gauge strings, the bow feels soft and lost. Really it can't really grab and work these strings as they need it. Coming back to the P, there's an equilibrium of forces, if you want to put it like that. So much about the more flexible or stiffer instruments and strings and bows. It's a bit of a shame that there are not so many good strings for these two ends of the spectrum. Like on the lower end of the tension spectrum, I have a couple of favorites. One of this is the Pirastro Violino, which is really quite soft. And then there's also the Pirastro Perpetual Cadenza, which is quite a bit more brilliant. So if you have a very flexible instrument that's kind of dark, that's a good option. And then there's also the Thomastic Vision Orchestra, which is also very low tension and I would say medium tuning. So a little warmer than the Cadenza, the Perpetual Cadenza, but not as quite as warm as the Violino. So something in the middle. But also the good old dominant strings is quite low in tension. and got a very complex and balanced sound. So there's the couple of interesting options. And the dominant Pro's also relatively soft, a little more tension than the dominants, just a tiny bit, and also with a rather warm sound, but more tension than, for example, the Violino. But yeah, I think this violin could also work very well with the dominant Pro strings, no problem. And the same is on the higher end tension spectrum. That's mostly covered by Larsen nowadays, with the Tzigane strong, with Il Canono soloist, Virtuoso strong, and the gold and silver. Other makers, there's a D'Addario Zayek strong, for example, which is also quite strong and warm, so that's similar to the Tzigane. So there are a few options, but really not that much of a choice. The regular Purastro Perpetual, for example, is also pretty much at the upper end of the tension spectrum and very bright. So if you have a stiff instrument, or rather stiff instrument, but which is very dark, then the Perpetual can be an interesting choice. And also the Jager Superior has a relatively high tension, but a very balanced sound. So there's a number of options. So if you want to look into this chart and combine it with this one, where we do explain the sound of the strings, put them in perspective between brilliance and warmth, and also the focus or the complexity of the string. But I'll talk about that a little later. So we'll come to that. Now, let's first go to the medium build instruments with average stiffness, of which I have three here. One is a rather dark sounding one a balanced, and one a very bright one. So only the stiffness doesn't tell us too much about the sound they'll produce. So for reference, I'll take a T6, which is our most balanced sounding bow, I would say. So this is the dark violin. The medium one. And the brilliant one. So I would say my preference is that this T-series bow works really well with this medium sounding instrument. But when we go, for example, for the dark sounding violin, I would much prefer the S bow. But let's reference with the T6 first. Now let's try the S. I find the sound is getting a lot more lively, a lot more interesting. Still not any sharp or anything on the E string. You can have the T on the E string, but the lower you get, the more interesting the S series bow goes with this instrument. And this fiddle already has some very brilliant sounding Jager eccentric strings on. So in my chart, I rate it as the most brilliant strings, useful string on the market today. And still we would go for the S series bow. So this is really a very dark sounding violin. It has pretty thin wall thickness, particularly the back. I think it's max 3.5 at the back, and also the top is like 2.3 millimeters, something like that. So it's a rather flexible instrument. The arching is not very high. It's got just the right size bass bar to balance it out, to give it the right stiffness in total. But it still remains a very warm, dark sounding instrument. So brightening it up with brilliant strings and a brilliant bow is just perfect. It makes it an adorable instrument. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Here we have an instrument that is really very bright sounding. And so the back is interestingly a one piece, but it's strong and the wood is stiff, and the same is true for the top. So it's very narrow grained. It's got a good arching, good bass bar and everything. It's well adjusted, still very bright. So let's look again with our reference T6. So the D string offers a sound that should be more like an A. And if you go to the A string, that's too brilliant for me. Now, we have the G series bows. That's a sound I like. That's a violin. Yeah, and it gives a roar down there. Now let's take a look again at the range of bows. So for this violin, we have this G series bow, which is our darkest sounding bow across our entire line. So if you have a violin that is pretty much on the brilliant side, that's the bow you want to try. And string wise, so this is really a very brilliant violin. So I've already put on some dominant pro strings, which are towards the lower end. I could also try if Perazzi Gold or Obligatos or Vision Solo. I think I've tried various sets of strings, really like that dominant pro string on that instrument, which tells you it's really not quite stiff or anything, right? But still very brilliant. So really you need to keep that apart. The brilliance, so bright and dark, and stiff and flexible. It get very little in common. There's some connection, but really not too much. So, yeah, as I said, we have these 3 files here for you to download. I've also put all this information in our latest brochures, which can guide you through the process of finding the right bow and the right strings for your instruments. So, there you have it. So the magic triangle or the 3-body problem pretty much solved. I would still like the string makers to give us a little more options on the lower and higher end spectrum of string tension. But yeah, we've seen great progress and with the development of violin strings, and we have a fantastic choice of strings nowadays, so that in reality we can find a perfect set of strings for pretty much any instrument. Oh, one little note. As a matter of fact, if I look back the last couple of years, 90% of musicians who came to our shop didn't have the right strings on the instrument. And many also had problems with their setup. So sound posts that were tilted, bridges too thick, tailgut too long, or this plastic tailgut, which we always replace with steel, stainless steel or brass. This is brass, this here is stainless steel, which works a lot better, it gives a better response. So yeah, you have to look after the whole setup of your instruments also. But sorting out the elasticity of the instrument, matching it with the right elasticity of strings and bows, and then sorting out the brilliance, warmth side of it, is very helpful. Now, the last topic I'd like to address is focus and complexity in strings. What we've discovered is that many wooden bows offer a pretty complex, if not to say noisy or somehow distorted sound. And so string makers tended to develop their strings for those wood bows, obviously. I mean, we're only Arcus, right? And so these very focused, clean sounding, almost to me laser-like sounding strings like the Eva Pirazzi Green, like the Peter Infeld or the Eva Gold also became quite fashionable. And I understand that, and it makes sense for many people who play with wooden bows. But if you have a very good bow, which can also be wood bow, and a very good instrument, usually that is too much focus and you're missing out on complexity, on richness, on articulation. So you can modify the sound really quite as much as with a string that is more complex or rich, or at least, let's say, medium focused instead of really very, very clean and tight. And we found that particularly with our high-end bows, which are also very clean and focused sounding, like let's say a T8 or T9 even, these strings generally don't work. The sound goes way too narrow and becomes simplistic in a way. So we want strings that are like down the middle of the road. So to have the right ability to modulate, to articulate, to change sound colors, which is why I'm a big fan of strings like Top Down, Jaga Evoke, Dynamo Solo, Jaga Superior, Rondo, Il Canone Medium, also the Vision solo strings, for example. Interestingly, the good old Dario Zax, not too bad. Tomastic Rondo Gold, strings like that really work fantastic, particularly with our high-end bows. If you get yourself, let's say, a T4 or T5, our lower-end Arcus bows, that's not so much of an issue. Then you can still play very focused sound if your instrument offers some complexity. But there's also instruments that are already quite focused, quite narrow. So if you find out that your instrument has, let's say, a balanced sound quality, and you're settled with a bow, let's say you have a T-series bow, whatever, then you can still try out different strings. Let's say, for example, a very focused Peter Infeld, a very broad sounding dominant string, for example, or tonica, or what else do we have here? Vision Stark, for example, or a medium one like the Superior, Rondo, or Il Canone, to find out whether you really want that focus in your sound or the complexity or something around the middle. So, I guess we've covered that. I hope you found it interesting. If you do, please give us a like, and and think about maybe checking out some more of our videos. And please, if you have any questions or comments, put them down in the section. And as promised, we'll have the download links for these documents in the description. All right, thanks for now, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.